afternoon. Am I keep it close? We can hear me. Good. We're working on a series about David. As Claire break, don't forget we have a potluck today. And if you didn't happen to bring any food, then that means you're the lucky one because there's lots of food. So have it as you come. Anyways, we're working on a series on David. Let's work our way through this. Next. The review today is just going to be the verses and the basic summaries, okay? Because we're getting so much stuff, we need to not spend too much time with it. Let's read this all together. This is the first important lesson we learn when we think about David and his heart. So let's read it all together. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, right? And you should have that verse. If you don't have it memorized, it should kind of be sitting in your head. We know that God works for the good of people who love Him. In everything, God is always working to do good for people who love Him. That was the first lesson. The second one comes down here at this, but we'll read the whole verse again. But the Lord said, all together, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider how handsome or tall he is. I have not chosen him. I cannot look at the things people look at. Man looks at how someone appears on the outside, but I look at what is in the heart. Right? And that was Samuel had picked the wrong guy with Saul, and he was about to pick the wrong guy with Eliab. And God said, no, David's got the right heart. He's got the right stuff inside. Next one. Two main ideas we got from the story of David and Goliath. The first is God helps those who help themselves, and know who you are. Oh no, those are not the ideas we got. Let's move it away. Next button should hit it there. That's got it. That'll both go away. So remember, it's God helps those who cannot help themselves, and God, remember, know whose you are. David could not defeat Goliath, but God defeated Goliath, right? Not because of what David was, not because of who he was, but because of the fact that God was involved in that fight. Next one. Then we talked about David's years in the wilderness, including his problems with Saul and his connection with Jonathan, right? Jealousy broke apart the relationship. But what brought it together? Commitment brings a relationship together. I was talking with someone yesterday because I was at a conference, and they were telling me about their parents who had been married for 60 years, about 50-something years, and they're apart now. And I just thought, oh, what a sad thing. That was because of jealousy, right, that kind of stuff. But commitment could have held them together, but they just kind of gave up after that time. David and Jonathan, that idea of commitment, no matter what happens, so key to building relationships. Next. Wilderness, facing the wilderness. Two ways that David faced the wilderness. He dealt with it sensibly and rationally, but he also had some crazy out there ideas that helped him deal with it, right? So here we got those. Next. Be sensible and think sideways. Don't forget also, I didn't get it on the video the next week, I'll remind you, when Jesus was in the wilderness, he had the Bible in his heart. In him, let's underline it. Yeah. So you need the Bible in you if you're facing a difficult time, right? You don't need the Bible in your phone, you don't need the Bible in the Bible, you have it in you, right? The psalmist in Psalm 119 says, I've hidden your word in my heart so that I won't sin against you. Then, we were talking about all this stuff happened during the time of King Saul. Finally, David became king. There he comes. Come on, King David, right? He became the king, finally. And he knew that was going to happen because from the beginning, God had said through Samuel, this is going to happen. Next. And it says, sometimes we just need to read to the end of the book. We're not going to become king, but we need to know what's going to happen sometimes. And it's worth, once in a while, stopping and reading to the end of the book. Let's read this together. Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from our eyes. There will God makes everything new. He's going to fix all the difficulties we face in life. And at some point that's going to happen. And so we know that. The Bible's very clear about it. And so when you're facing hard times, maybe you need to read to the end of the book. You know, when you're reading a novel, sometimes it looks like the guy, the main character, is going to die. But if you turn to the back page and you see his name still there, you know it's all going to be okay, right? Well, we can turn to the back page to Revelation 20 and 21. We can turn to 1 Thessalonians. We can turn and read to the end of the story and know that in the end, God makes it all okay. Next. We're dealing now, no longer with this time when King Saul was king and a lot of the big stories about David happened. We're going to deal with all the stories about King David as king. So let's bring him over here. And leave him here for today, at least to remind us all the stories now, from now on, are about David as the king. And today's story is a story about, well, this thing. You know what this is? It's a picture, a drawing, obviously. You know what this is? This is the ark. Oh, that can't be the ark. The ark was the thing with Noah and all the animals, right? But this is also the ark. I wonder why that is. Do you know what the word ark means in Hebrew? I meant to be saying but by mistake I was saying so it's a little more. Ark is box. Ark just means big box. Okay? So Noah didn't have a boat. Noah had a big box. And when you read the description of it, it seems just to be a big long box. Okay, so it was Noah's big box. The ark, this ark, is the ark of God's promises. Okay? A box of God's promises. That's all it is. It's a box, okay? But we call it ark because it sounds kind of cool and impressive, but it just means the box of God's promises. And what they had inside it, they had the 10 Commandments that God had written on the stone with his finger. And then they also put a jar containing some manna that seemed to never disintegrate. And then also the staff that Aaron had that budded and used to work miracles, that God had used to work miracles. So that's the ark, right? And the ark was important for the Israelites because of this spot right about here. There's two angels on top of the ark, and in between the angels, at certain times, God would manifest himself. God would make himself visible. Not as a little tiny man or something, but just a glowing light. The Hebrew word for it is Shekinah. And so they call it the Shekinah, the glory that shone between those two angels. And sometimes, at certain times and places in Israel's history, there would be kind of this glowing light to remind them that God was with them. That God was with them. The same way he had been with them in the wilderness as a light, a pillar of fire that led them during the daytime, or a pillar of fire at night and clouds during the daytime. God made himself visible. And so they can say, God is with us, definitely. So that was the ark. It was kind of the center of worship for Israel. The problem is that it somehow lost the center of worship. They lost kind of the most important thing for their religion. And it just kind of disappeared. Well, not quite disappeared. Next page. It was in this place called Gath. And that was because under King Saul, they wanted to have a battle with the Philistines, right? This area, what do we call this today? Gaza. This is Gaza. And Gaza is where the Philistines live. What's that word, Philistines? Do you know that word in modern English? Philistine. Yeah, Palestinians, right? The Philistines, the Palestinians, and Israel have been fighting since before King David, right? And so at this point, the Philistines and Israel are having a battle. The Israelites lost. And so they thought, they just imagined this. There's no reason, God never told them this, but they imagined that if they carried the ark with them, they couldn't lose the battle. So they went back to fight the same battle again, carrying the ark with them, and they lost, because God hadn't promised the ark as some magic tool to win all your battles for you. So they lost the battle, and the Philistines conquered, or took the ark when they beat them in the battle. So they took the ark, and they were kind of, it was like they saw it as one of the idols of Israel, right? Israel wasn't worshiping the ark, but they imagined it was like one of their idols. So they were giving a little victory tour around Palestine. They took it to one place, and a bunch of people got sick. They took it to another. Eventually they ended up in this place called Gath, which is where Goliath was from. And the people there all got cancer, or some kind of tumors growing on them. And so they didn't want it. Like, everywhere they took the ark, the people were getting sick and dying. And so the Philistines said, let's get rid of this thing. It's killing us. It's not good for us. So the people of the Philistines sent it back to Israel. They didn't want to destroy it because they were afraid that would destroy them. So they said, we'll just give it back to the people we stole it from. So they did. So they sent it. There, we got it. And it ends up in a place called Bet Shemesh. Okay? Yeah. This is a town, a little town. And the Israelites said, okay, we'll take it here. We got it from here. The Philistines handed it over, even though they conquered it and stolen it. They said, no, you can take it back. People of Bet Shemesh were interested in it. They weren't the people who were supposed to be taking care of the ark. They weren't the Levites or the priests. And they said, you know, I really wonder what's inside this thing. So they opened it up, and 70 of them looked inside and died eventually because of it. God had said, don't be opening this thing. The people kind of knew that. They wanted to look inside anyways. And so they looked at inside, and they died. So, not surprisingly, the Israelites now, the people of Bet Shemesh, said, we don't want it in our town either. It's as bad for us as it was for the Philistines. So they moved it to a little place called Kiriath Jearim. And there it stayed for a bunch of years. Because remember, this was around the time of Saul, when it had come back to Israel from the Philistines. And waited there for all this time for King David. Finally, King David says, I'm king, I've built my palace, I got everything ready, it's time for the ark to come to the center of Israel, to Jerusalem. It had been called Jebus, and David had conquered it and made it into Jerusalem and said, this is my city, but in the center of my city, I'm going to put God's ark. So he goes out to Kiriath Jearim and picks up the ark. Eventually, they start to bring it into town. Gets to Obed-Edom's house. God had given really clear description about how to move the ark around. He said, this is a representation of me. And I want this ark to be properly taken care of anytime you move it. So he said, put these big long poles in it. So they put the long poles in. And then he said, the way to move it is for the priests to carry it on their shoulders, 2 sets of them. Right? Well, David, when he was bringing it from Kiriath Jearim to Obed-Edom's house, he didn't really care what God said. He just said, well, what's the easiest way to move this thing? It's big and heavy. We'll put it on an ox cart. So they got some cows and a cart behind them, and they put their thing there, and it was bumping along. They didn't have good shocks, obviously, back then, and it was just going along, going along. At Obed-Edom's house, it looks like it's going to fall off the cart. And one of the guys in the group goes to stabilize it. And God killed him for that. Because God said, this is not for anyone to touch. Even if it looks like it's going to fall, you just don't worry about that. Obey me. What I said is don't touch it. And so this guy dies. And so now David says in the story, he says, how can I possibly bring this back to town? We will all die. They're afraid of this thing. And they should be, because it was, remember, this is the picture of God's presence here on earth. And so they were kind of afraid of it, and they were learning to have the proper respect for it. They leave it at Obed-Edom's house, basically. They just kind of park it there. And they say, the people start to say, man, everything is going well for Obed-Edom. That's the guy's name, right? Everything is going well for him. Things are just great for him. And it stayed there for about 3 months. And David says, I want some of that too. I want things to go well for me. I was bringing it to Jerusalem, but I just left it at Obed-Edom's, and now he's got the luck of Israel. God's blessing him for taking care of the ark. So finally David does the right thing. He looks in the Word and he gets the right instructions about how to move this sacred object. And finally David says, okay, we're going to do it right, we're going to bring it into town, and we're going to do it upright. And so he does. Let's move it in there, into Jerusalem. And look, there was dancing. And people were happy, right? Because finally, now the center of worship had come to the center of the nation. The two things were finally connected again. It had been wandering around, this ark had left them and was, here and there and causing problems, but now it was where it should be, and the people could recognize that God's presence was right there in the middle of everything, like it deserved to be. When they'd been wandering through the wilderness for many years, the ark was always in the center of the camp, right? And now it's back to where it should be. God's presence, that's what the ark represents, in the center of the nation, where it should be. And finally, everything's working out. They're quite happy, right? So David, as the leader of the nation, he's pretty happy too. And so this is what it is. He gets himself a thing called an ephod. I made myself a little ephod here. Basically, this is an ephod. And the ephods, they were kind of like other people used them, not just Israelites. And they would just, you know how we can have like t-shirts that have writing on them? They didn't have t-shirts with writing. So an ephod was the closest they would have to something with writing on it. So they might put like some rocks on here, and a rock would represent something. The ones that the priests had a rock on each shoulder, on the shoulder straps, and on top of it was some engraving, right? So David puts on an ephod, right? And then he puts on his regular linen robe, we know from 2 Chronicles or 1 Chronicles. Puts on his robe, and you know, of course, that people in Bible times, they wore bathrobes everywhere they went, right? So he puts on his bathrobe. Okay, and so this is basically how David looks. Ties his robe up. He's in a hurry, though. He's in a hurry to get to where the ark is coming in. So he's in a bit of a hurry. He ties himself in, and then he he sees the ark coming into town, and he's just so happy. He starts dancing. Before you know it, David's dancing like this. Okay, but what did David put on? David put on his belt and his robe and his ephod. Did he have a whole set of clothes underneath? No, he didn't. Okay? The problem was that David kind of forgot to put on any underwear or anything else. And so when he's dancing around and his robe opens, he's pretty well out there for everyone to see. David didn't care. David was so happy that God's ark, the reminder of God's presence, was coming back into the center of their community. He didn't care what anyone saw, and he just kept dancing. It says, there's a fun little side story. It says, David's wife, Michal, she was actually Saul's daughter. She had stayed in town when David was coming to bring the ark back in. And she's looking from her top floor window, and she sees David dancing with all his might, and his robe flies open, and he's just wearing the ephod basically at one point. And she sees that, and she says, oh, what a disgusting, embarrassing thing this is. Doesn't he have any sense of decency? What's he doing that for? And it says, God punished her for that attitude. Because David, at that point, had the right attitude. Now, I'm not saying wander around naked. Please don't think I'm telling you to join a nudist colony or something. I'm not. But we got to stop worrying about what people think of us when we're worshiping God. And worshiping God, remember, isn't just singing and music and dancing. It's so much more than that. So we got to not worry about what people think when we're giving ourselves to God. Next page. Here's a little picture of it. It's a children's picture, so they put underwear on. He probably didn't have it on. He probably just had this kind of ephod-y thing hanging over top of him. And he wasn't worried about anything. I love the expression of the guy. He said, he's so happy. the picture of God's presence is coming back to the center of their community. He's so happy about that whole situation. Here's the priests. See, they're doing the right thing. They don't have the ark on a cart anymore. It's being carried by men who have been consecrated, who have been set apart just to take care of this box that reminds us of God's presence with us. The people are so happy. You can't see David's wife, but she's somewhere up there looking down, literally looking down on him, and looking down on him saying, oh, why is he doing that? Has he forgotten who he is? He's the king of Israel, and now everyone's going to laugh at him and me. Right? But no, David had the right idea. He didn't care. He was doing what mattered most, and that was worshiping God. Here's what we can learn from this. First of all, worship is important, right? And we need to put worship at the core of who we are, right? We sang to them this morning, this afternoon, I'm coming back to the heart of worship. And it's all about you, Jesus. It's all about you. Worship is giving ourselves to God, and it's really important. And David recognized that. Next, we need to pay attention to God, right? God said, this is how you carry the ark. God said, don't look inside the ark. Don't touch the ark. He said those things very clear in his word. And they disobeyed those things, and people died because of it. We need to pay attention to God. God doesn't smite us anymore very often. But he was making a point. Listen to what he has to say. And we have those stories to remind us that God cares about how we do things. He cares. And so he wants us to listen to him, to pay attention to him. But at the same time, we also need to don't pay attention to the people around you. Don't care what they think. They don't matter. What matters is what God says. Get worshiping, get serving God. Forget about those people. Forget about everyone else. Pay attention to what God says. Put worshiping God, serving God, putting him in the right place. That's got to be the core, the center of our life, the center of our community. David brought the ark on home to Jerusalem, where it belonged, because it reminded them that God is right here with us. And it reminded them that we worship him in this community. And that's what we need to do. We need to worship him in our community. We need to put worshiping him, put him in the very center of it. I think we just have the Lord's Prayer, and then sort of pray, and finish that, and then we have several things. Holy Father in heaven, we thank you that the story of David reminds us to put you in the center. Your presence has got to be in the center of our community, in the center of our lives. Don't let us leave you out to the edges, or out with the Philistines, or wherever it is. Let us bring you and who you are right into the core of our lives and our community. Father, help us to do that, paying attention to you, the way you said to do it, focusing on you, as you said, Lord Jesus, in spirit and in truth. And help us to ignore the people who don't want to be part of it. Help us to ignore their complaints and their disagreements, Father. Help us just to focus on what you want, and make you our everything and our all. Thank you again for this lovely example of David. But Father, even more, we thank you for the perfect example of Jesus, who worshiped you with his whole life, his whole being. It's in his name we pray this, as he taught us to pray, saying, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever.